government today tabled the economic survey, and joining us now on ET Now is Dr. KV Subramanian. Sir, thanks for taking your time out and speaking to us at ET Now. Congratulations on your first survey. Also joining us is our consulting editor, Mythili, Bhusnurmath. Mythili, a very interesting topic today, shifting gears for, reaching the $5 trillion economy mark.
Absolutely. Let me second that congratulations. And also ask you, economic surveys tend to be a little idealistic, as you said, the blue sky thinking. And for that reason, they sometimes tend to be a little long on vision and short on details. Does the latest economic survey also fall into that same quote-unquote trap? Because you've talked about shifting gears, increasing private sector investment. But that is something that the government has been trying for the past 5 years and hasn't quite succeeded. So how do we get there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5?
Okay. First of all, good evening to all the viewers, and thanks a lot for having me here. So let me start with, respond to a philosophical question like that with a philosophy.
Answer, okay.
Which is that if you look at any transformation that, across the world, wherever it has happened, it always starts with an idea. And that is the job of someone in my role to provide. As Einstein used to say, if you keep doing the same thing, you can't expect a different outcome. You have to start doing things differently, which is what we've tried to do in the economic survey. Intentionally, we've actually, especially the first chapter, trying to keep the length, in terms of just sort of manageable. We decided, made a conscious choice to not get into each other's specific details, which we certainly can. But our main intent with this survey was to try and change our thinking, and we've tried to do that at multiple levels. One, what we've tried to do is we've said that instead of viewing different problems, whether it's of jobs, of exports, etc., in silos, let's view them as a system, because they are complementary. Absolutely. And that's the way a second important aspect is that I think now, economic thinking itself has evolved a lot in the last 10 years, and I've been fortunate enough as someone who does research in this area to sort of witness that change that has happened. To view an economy as basically being in a virtuous or a vicious cycle, this concept of an equilibrium does not quite work very well.
How do you get into that virtuous cycle?
So that's exactly why. So if you pick up the first chapter, one of the first sets of evidence that's been provided is looking at countries that were at a similar stage, when they started their growth process, and what did they do in order to actually get to where they are. And the incontrovertible evidence that comes through all of them is that they actually set out on a very high investment path. And it is that investment that actually led to productivity increases, and those productivity increases then translated into an export-intensive sector. Because if you have to, especially if you have to compete in international markets, you have to be very, very productive and competitive. And then it feeds in, so that various aspects of that virtuous cycle that we've spoken about. So let me be very, very emphatic here and say that this is not just something, this is an important idea that we need to sort of really take on board. Apart from this, we're also saying, for instance, we keep sort of talking about job creation. But the fact is that unless firms grow enough to be able to generate enough jobs, exploit economies of scale, because one of the sort of the myths that prevails is that our small firms are creating enough jobs, but they also destroy jobs.
Sure, absolutely.
It's the larger firms, they actually have they achieve that stability to be able to create permanent jobs. So these are important changes in mindset, and that's why I will not underemphasize this, that the risk we ran actually of when we were making a choice about what to focus on is if we had gone down the path of basically looking at the details, the big picture would have gotten mixed.
No, indisputable, but high investment must come from high savings.
Yes.
But our savings rate actually has been falling.
So I'll come to that, right? And we basically have looked at that as well. And one of the charts that is there is that favorable demographics, especially one of the key factors is the dependency ratio, which is the number of children that elder people have to depend on. When that decreases, what that does in the economy is savings increase. Why? Because if I have, let's say I had 5 kids to rely on for my retirement, then I would not save as much. But if I only have 1 kid, then and if the possibility is that maybe that kid for whatever reason is not able to support support me, I have to take care of myself, and therefore I end up saving for retirement. This is something that again happens in all economies as the, as lifespan increase, as the dependency ratios go down, in economies savings go up. You were talking about the decrease in the savings. The main thing that has happened actually is household assets have declined, not the financial savings. So we have to be a little careful in actually what are we looking at, and therefore the emphasis that we are making is that household assets seem to have gone down because there's been a little bit more emphasis on consumption. But the key point we are making is, if for instance savings have to be at a level to actually drive investment, then you can't have your cake and eat it too. You have to actually, have less consumption. And that is why these countries that grew very well emphasized exports, because if domestic consumption is not going to actually create the demand for the investment and the virtuous cycle, it is the foreign demand, which is basically given by exports. That's what creates this virtuous cycle. And one of the key points, if you noticed, is that, in the press conference I showed this as well, is that as for China, you saw consumption as a percentage of GDP going down significantly, while their investment and savings increased, exponentially. Even if you look at it in terms of development time, and that is, I go back to a question that Ruchi asked, saying, is this about, does this work for developing economies? I want to emphasize again that, that's why we've shown it as a function of development scale. Each of those countries from whom we've picked up this evidence, indeed were at a stage when they started growing using this investment-driven virtuous cycle, were at a stage that were possibly worse than ours. And yet it was the investment-driven virtuous cycle that enabled them to actually reach where they've reached. So this is a model that is eminently applicable for India, because we've not borrowed from something that the OECD's countries are doing, because they're at a different stage. We've looked carefully at the evidence of countries that were at a similar stage and yet have followed this path. Now the question about investment that comes in, and some of the details actually. So I'm going to come to that. So one of the key things that is important is, right now we have to recognize that domestic capital is not, is basically at a premium in some sense, right? In contrast, and this sort of the wedge is very, very strong, globally the liquidity conditions and the interest rate environment is extremely benign. And therefore, this is a wonderful opportunity for us to tap into some of that foreign capital, which is looking for opportunities. So both the demand and supply side will work, because if we actually are committing to an investment-driven path, or which basically leads to 8% growth, then that foreign capital looks for opportunities to actually make good returns as well. At the same time, because of the liquidity and the interest rate conditions, we also have the opportunity to go and utilize that. So this is something which we have to really, because if you think about it, this kind of benign interest rate environment and the liquidity conditions may not prevail 5 years from now. When the going is good, we should basically exploit it really to further, because savings right now, as and we recognize very well, savings are not going to increase immediately. So in the short run, you have to enable the foreign capital to come in and thereby foster investment, so that you trigger that investment, that this cycle. Once you trigger it, then actually the others, it takes care of itself and becomes in a sustained
Dr. Subramanian, you're also talking about how, there is a need to push private investment. This is something that the government has been trying for a very long time, but that really hasn't happened. So how do you expect that change to come in? Firstly, that. Secondly, you're talking about an optimal tax policy. Can that really be done at a time like this, when revenue itself is a big concern for the government, and also the point on cost of capital?
See, let me respond to your second point immediately. Optimal tax policy does not mean tax cuts. I think let's make that very, very clear. Optimal tax policy, we've talked about, one of the cardinal principles of investment is that expected return has to correlate with risk. And now risk and return, if you think about, there's upside and there's downside as well. We've taken care of the downside by through the IBC process. But upside, when the project does well, if you do not anticipate, let's say, some proportionate return, then your incentive to invest actually gets affected. That's the point we are making. There are many ways to respond and actually implement this big idea optimal risk return trade-offs actually, and thereby affecting investment. One among them is is tax policy, certainly, but there's also, you can think about the way we treat our startups, the way we actually encourage our startups, because startups, you have to recognize, are a lot riskier than your traditional firms. So the idea here is to ensure that the risk return trade-offs get aligned, and tax policy is but one of the the tools in that particular. Your first question, if you just remind me of
on the cost of capital.
On the cost of capital.
Cost of capital was a third point, I think.
And the fact that private investment hasn't really come in.
So I think this is, it's an important point. We have to sort of sift through the leaves and really look at what has been going on. Investment, for instance, number one, always happens, the effect of that on growth happens with a lag. Investment itself, oftentimes, it's a sticky thing, right? So the drag on investment in the last 5 years, to a large measure, has been because of the overhang that has been created from the previous 5 years, which is that, you had the dual balance sheet problem. As a result of which, then what happened, we basically took corrective measures, especially we went, created the bankruptcy code. Now, what the bankruptcy code does on project financing and on the way you actually do capital budgeting is really important to understand, because earlier, let's say I as an investor, could have, in the Indian context, could have done some projections that are basically in Excel, and I don't have to worry about it whether it transpires in reality, because I always knew that there are ways in which I could work this out. But today, if I actually indulge in the same activity, I run the risk of actually having to go to IBC and then my company being taken away from me. As a result, the way I will do capital budgeting changes. Now remember, the expertise to do capital budgeting carefully is not something that develops overnight. This is a process that is happening. That is why I'm talking about the overhang from the previous 5 years, which transpired both in terms of the balance sheets of the banks and the balance sheets of the corporates, and the culture of actually better capital budgeting, which is, so as a result, people will obviously be careful in the way they do the investment. So they may, if for instance, earlier they may have said, okay, at a hurdle rate of 10% I'm ready to go, but now they say, okay, give me another 1% cushion and then I'll actually make that investment, and obviously it will have an effect on so it is really critical that we recognize that the last 5 years, the reduction in the investment is not because actually government has not tried or because of actually policies have not worked. It is the overhang, and that overhang takes its own time, because when the ramp up in investment happened over an 8-year period, to expect, let's say, the ramp down to happen instantly ain't going to be. Nobody has a magic wand to be able to create that. So this is, I think it's an important point, particularly because we're talking about the investment as a key driver in the cycle. It is definitely possible because of the kind of steps that we are taking, especially through the IBC, and we've also talked about some of the other details, ensuring, for instance, consistency of policy making, because that is something that really
because
affects.
In fact, you have talked about and the fact is, in fairness to the government, policy uncertainty has come down. Despite that, investment has also come down. So there's a contradiction here.
No, there's no contradiction. It's a contradiction if you look at it in a univariate sense, which is if you look only at the impact of the uncertainty, reduction in the policy uncertainty on investment. But recognize that investment is something that is affected by a zillion other variables.
Absolutely.
So the contradiction is only if you look at it in a limited sense of only the correlation between uncertainty and investment. But investment, as I just explained now, is affected by a lot of other variables, especially the overhang. So you have to control for the effect of the other effects. Once you do that, and that is what we've shown actually in the chapter, that when you control for other determinants, then the impact of uncertainty is indeed so that if you reduce uncertainty, investment will go up. But you cannot make this conclusion just by looking at that univariate
But
correlation.
one way of dealing with the overhang, which you in fact have written about earlier, would have been to start a bad bank. But surprisingly, the survey is silent on two big issues that are currently plaguing the country, as it were. One is rural distress, and the other one is the problems with public sector banks. But the survey is surprisingly silent on both these issues.
As well as
Why?
NBFCs.
Let me make a... So, again, when we sat down to think about the survey, we had a choice to make, which is, do we go, some sectors, or do we lay out a path for the next 5 years? This being the first, new government, and which has come with a mandate. Of course, we didn't know that when we were working on this, but the fact that this was, what we certainly knew is whichever government came will basically be a new government. It's an opportunity for us to set out a new template for trying to put the economy on a fast path. If we had gone down, of course, you have to actually, we couldn't have written a 500-page survey on the other. We will be, definitely addressing some of the issues. We're going to write another survey in the next 6 months. Some of these issues we will definitely on our agenda. We will talk about it. This was a conscious choice that we made to let's focus on the big picture, what needs to be done for actually the sustained growth rate to be created.
Dr. Subramanian, before I let you go, and I know we're very short on time, your survey also points to various behavioral tools. You're talking about how there is a, we should be moving from the Swachh Bharat to a newer form of Swachh and, Swasth and Sundar Bharat. Would you say it's a very simplistic approach to because betting big on behavioral changes itself is going to take a very, very long time? Or the other flip side to this is that is there a need to perhaps recalibrate the policy approach with respect to these sectors that you've pointed out?
So let me first, point number one here I want to make is that there is ample research now in behavioral economics, which culminated in the Nobel Prize in 2017 in this area. So to actually then, if I would put the two together, you would say basically the Nobel Prize has been given for something that is very simplistic. I don't think that would actually be a right characterization, number one. Number two, I will recall the time when our Prime Minister, Honorable Prime Minister, spoke about Swachh Bharat from the ramparts of the Red Fort in 2014. A lot of people said, why is he talking about toilets from the ramparts of the Red Fort? This is theory. It's not going to happen in, Again, I want to remind you, every revolution in this world has started with an idea. And that is something that is really important to remember. And the characteristic of that revolutionary idea is that 99.9% of people think it is just theory. It is that 0.1% that believes that this is an idea that can bring transformational change. Marginal change, actually, let me finish that point. The marginal ideas always look realistic, but transformational ideas, when they are put, always actually have their skeptics. That is the intrinsic nature of a transformative idea. And behavioral change, as we've seen over the last 5 years, indeed, take a look at, we've talked about this, which is the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao and the Swachh Bharat mission. If we can bring about the kind of change that has happened in 5 years, especially on sanitation, then I have every right and every opportunity to believe that we can indeed do it. It's all about bringing together.
I buy that entirely, but I have to interrupt you over here just to say, while it's great, ideas are important, great ideas are wonderful, but at the moment, is there a need for concrete action? And what would that action be? Would there be a fiscal stimulus?
The concrete action comes from the ideas that, if you do not have good ideas, concrete actions cannot happen. The actions may be concrete, but may be barking at the wrong tree. And that is the risk that you actually have. The job of someone like me is, the reason I actually am in this government, someone like me is there to point out some of those important ideas. And we complement. We have a team here who actually will take a look at these ideas and, and think about if we provided some of that template as well to be able to, for instance, we've talked about how do you reduce policy uncertainty. The specific suggestions, in terms of looking at job creation, we provided, so with appropriate grandfathering, let's actually move to have a sunset clause on incentives. So these are actually, many of these are not necessarily ideas that are seeking at, so we have provided that as well, but there are, illustrative examples of how you take that policy to the ground level and implement it as well.
All right. On
Thank you
that
so
note,
much.
Mr. Subramanian, thanks for taking your time.
And all the very best of luck that your ideas resonate with the government.
Yes, pleasure. Thank you.